Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I ask you to take the seats, please? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third day of our Global Space Exploration Conference. I hope you enjoyed the off-site reception yesterday in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, and you are looking forward to an interesting program today again. We'll have our second keynote lecture this morning, and I'm pleased to welcome here on stage Mr. John Shannon, NASA Deputy Associate Administrator, who will introduce to you our keynote lecture speaker.
Good morning. I'm sure everybody is very interested and ready to talk about the synergies between lunar research, which we have some significant experience in the new world of asteroids, which we are just starting to talk about. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Clive Neal. Dr. Neal is a professor in the Department of Civil Engineering and Geological Sciences at the University of Notre Dame. That's where he specializes in igneous petrology and geochemistry. He has over 23 years of experience working with lunar samples to unravel the history of the moon through studying their petrography and geochemistry. Professor Neal graduated with honors in geology from the University of Leicester, obtained his doctorate in mantle geochemistry from the University of Leeds, and did postdoctoral research at the University of Tennessee. Professor Neal has been at Notre Dame since 1990. He's been working on cutting-edge research to understand the origin and evolution of the moon. Professor Neal will talk to us today about those synergies between that lunar research and asteroid exploration. Dr. Neal.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming out relatively early, I suppose. It's good that the temperature has got down. I have no idea where my slides are. Nothing's coming up here. So this will be an adventure for everybody. Synergies. We've been talking a lot about synergies, international cooperation, coordination, and leveraging capabilities, although that term hasn't come up. But when we look at the reality of solar system exploration, synergies are what are going to make it happen, whether it be between technology developments that are going to be applied to different locations or targets, or whether it be to industry, whether or not there's going to be synergies, there's going to be government-industry partnerships. And let's not forget the academics. As Jerry Sanders said yesterday, we have to throw them a bone every now and again. And being one of those recipients of said bones, I'd like to thank you very much. I'd like to thank you for the invite to be here to talk about this, because I'm very passionate about the moon. And then when the asteroids came on, well, we started to think a little differently about the moon. So to give you some perspective on the slides here, we're looking at the nature of the beasts. We're looking at a perspective of Mars. We've got Mercury in there. We've got the moon, of course, and then we get down to some of the larger asteroids. The Dawn mission is currently visiting Vesta, and it's on its way to Ceres. And you can see the sort of perspective with regards to that. The thing that we look at is science and exploration, and I've put these up in a sort of cartoonish form, because what we see is that there's normally a wall between the two. This is the way NASA used to be, with the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate and the Science Mission Directorate, and there was a brick wall between the two, and you were not allowed to go around said wall. It's changed. It's changed because the thing that we see that if you're going to do exploration, you're going to do science. If you're going to do science, you're going to explore and make discoveries. That is exploration. So you can use the words interchangeably. It's just that we've put different connotations on science and exploration. They're the same thing. I'll give you an example from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. This was set up to go to the moon to get those data that we needed to send humans safely back to the moon and not just wing it as Buzz and Neal did on Apollo 11 with a computer that was, well, let's say, underpowered. But what we see here is that the instruments on that mission are still up there. They're still gathering data, but there was a handover between the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate and Science Mission Directorate. The same instruments that were getting the exploration data are now getting fantastic science data. They're the same data sets. And it shows you the synergies between exploration and science. And it also shows the cooperation that can be had just within different mission directorates of NASA. Now, if we then expand that and look at Chandrayaan, where we had international participation in an orbital mission to the moon, and the data that has come out of that mission and still continues to come out is something that we need to take a lessons from, and again go to the ultimate one, and we've heard it many times with the International Space Station, where we have necessary and vital international cooperation. So what we started with, and I'm having trouble seeing these slides, I may have to move, but what we started with here is we can see that about 5 or 6 years ago, we had a global exploration roadmap that was put out after the vision of space exploration was announced. We were going back to the moon to go to Mars and beyond. I heard the term stepping stone mentioned many times. But everybody was excited. International coordination and cooperation was at a high. We had 14 nations signed up to this roadmap. And then we had a bit of a sea change in terms of at least in this country, in terms of where we were going to go. And I put this up with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, but in terms of the science community, this was exactly the way it was perceived. Although when we actually calmed down a little bit and actually looked at what could go on, we started to look more detail at other airless bodies. And again, here, being a moon guy, I'm thinking, well, it's an airless body. It's the nearest near-Earth object. So the Lunar Exploration Analysis Group decided that we would rename it Neo Prime. We would be very politically correct. And, of course, the moon was still on the radar. So it was something that had to be done. But seriously, we come back and we look at the global exploration strategy. Aha, this is better. Now I can wander. All right, thank you. Is this working? Hello? Not working? Bring it up. Or not? No, you don't want that. So it's not working. It was working. Not anymore. Anyway, so no. So we're now at the stage where we have a global exploration strategy, and you can see the multiple destinations that are there and the pathways that have been outlined as national priorities, maybe. But in terms of science and in terms of the Lunar Exploration Analysis Group, we look at airless bodies and we look at the synergies between the two. So what I want to do here is to try and sort of go through some of the thinking that has gone on and how to develop those synergies. But I also want to address the 600-pound gorilla in the corner. Which one is sustainable? Which one is affordable? And to try and give some insight to that. And at the end of the talk, there may be some time for questions, which would be which will be interesting. So, is that working here? I'm going to try now. All right. Well, I'm going to come over here and talk to this screen over here if I can see it. So again, which one is sustainable? Which approach is going to be sustainable in the two things that we have in the global exploration strategy? And again, what makes something sustainable? We have to go back and look at that in terms of what is going to be sustainable. And again, thank you. Oh, that's better. That's working. So when we're looking at this, we have, you know, political will, but the big thing, international collaboration, public support, and the things that we've looked at at League is, well, what about investment? Taxpayers pay a lot of money to put people into space, and what are they going to get out of it? And we see from Apollo, we have technology advances, we have, you know, big thing is jobs these days. We need jobs and general creation of wealth, or at least perceived creation of wealth. So precursor missions in terms of asteroid exploration, let's look at that now and see, can we do precursors? If we look at the Apollo program, we were doing precursors long before we sent humans. But what about precursor missions to a near-Earth object? Is that going to be possible? First human flight, 2025. But can we do precursors to reduce that risk? And I put on here, you can see here, this is what we would be relying on as telescopic imaging. But as you can see here from the same object, Vesta, this is the Dawn mission, we get much more detail. So without those precursor missions, do we inevitably increase risk? So what are the challenges then? We can see we got changing lighting conditions. Some of these objects are rotating. We can see that from here. But the changing lighting conditions mean changing thermal conditions on a near-Earth objects, and the rapidity of some of these rotations make for a very challenging environment. What about sampling strategy? You're now trying to sample in microgravity. You go hit something on there, it's not going to break. You may end up just flying off in the opposite direction. So we do have some. I've got two now. All right. So this one, oh my goodness. So this one is working. I'll hold it down here. But there are risks associated if you send humans out to an asteroid, and the technology development that's required, not only in the SEV, but the systems to get you out there are going to be quite substantial. So do they get out of the SEV when they're there? Or do they just sample from within? And the picture down here shows the robotic arm that is on the SEV. But we look at the synergies. We've looked at some of the challenges with going to asteroids, but what are the synergies between lunar exploration and asteroid exploration? Well, the common one is they're airless bodies. We have a harsh environment for humans to actually survive in. Dusty environments, we've heard a lot about dust at this conference, which actually is something not to be taken lightly, because it can be quite detrimental in terms of survivability with the systems that we're going to be relying on. We've got regoliths, we've got large temperature swings between night and day. There's the ISRU potential, and I want to come back to this later on. And again, we've got both that contain volatiles and metals, which can be used either in returning to mine or actually using for life support and fuel. So what are the pros of actually using the moon to enable asteroid exploration? And again, we've gone through some of these, but the big thing in terms of using the moon is proximity. It is close. We can see it. We go out, we look at it, and I look up there most nights, having my grandson on my shoulders when he was 2 years old, and I looked up and I said, "You see that up there, boy? One day you're going to be up there, and you're going to collect your granddad some rocks." And then from behind me, my daughter said, "Over my dead body." But there is similarity in some of the technology developments that are going to be required. The big con is gravity. We have gravity on there that enables very similar types of field work that we do on this planet to be done on the moon, but we have to rethink that when we actually go to asteroids. And then implementation. Implementation is going to be reliant upon international cooperation and commercial participation. There's no way around that, and that's just the fiscal reality of space exploration in the 21st century. So parallel technology developments, I've just put a smorgasbord up here of the different things that need to be developed if we're going to go to the moon or we're going to go to asteroids. It's not an exhaustive list, but it shows you the synergies. We're dealing with airless bodies. We're not dealing with specific destinations. And this is something that I want to try and develop throughout the talk, is we're dealing with solar system exploration. We're not dealing with asteroids. We're not dealing with the moon. We're not dealing with Mars. We're dealing with developing capabilities that take us to into the solar system. And I think when we get hung up on a specific location, then things can start to get a bit interesting, especially in terms of international cooperation. So again, as I alluded to, we've got different lighting conditions, and what I've pointed out in this diagram here is that we can see that by photographs of asteroids, but also in terms of the moon. There are different lighting conditions where we can actually undertake controlled experiments. And you can see it here, where we've got, it's the lunar day, and we have shadow. We have shadow that we can then use in terms of controlled experiments to test, and it depends upon the size of the shadow that you want. This brilliant picture up here from Tycho crater, the central peak from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter camera, shows it in very stark detail, something that we've never seen before. So again, these lunar control tests can be used to develop the thermal systems that we're going to need to safely send humans out to explore asteroids. Robotic human interactions. There was a panel on this yesterday. Teleoperations are going to be critical both on the moon, especially for exploration during the lunar night, but also on asteroids, especially in that microgravity environment. And then mitigation of dust. You could see here just the very fact that the Apollo suits got covered with dusts meant that the reflectivity was not there, and the thermal system started to get a bit pushed, trying to maintain the temperature. But what about seals? Dust into seals and dust into working parts of robots that are going to be required in the next era of space exploration. We've got the electrostatic issues that go along with dust and the charging. How do you then ground things in terms of a very dry vacuum? And again, you can see this lofting issue that hopefully LADDI, which will launch, I believe, in 2013, is going to hopefully try and address. We get snapshots of it here. This is a picture of Clementine looking at the hazy view at the lunar dawn as we go from night to day, and the lofting, or apparent lofting, of lunar dust into the exosphere. The radiation environment, and of course on Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter we have Crater, an experiment that is actually looking at the radiation environment of the moon during various times of solar minimum, and now as we see it ramping up to being a little bit more lively, and actually measuring and quantifying in the lunar orbit what those doses are going to be. But then we've got mitigation technologies on top of that. And again, this can be somewhat controlled if we're on the moon. Most of the time we're out of the Earth's magnetic field influence, and we can actually undertake controlled experiments on the moon in relative safety compared to being out in deep space. And then I'm going to come back to the in-situ resource utilization potential. And again, for LEAG, this is, if you saw my talk yesterday, this is something that we think is going to be a game changer and something that's going to enable solar system exploration. But we need to develop technologies that give us confidence to put this in the critical path for space exploration in the 21st century. So the question then, is human exploration of asteroids sustainable? Right now we have limited targets, What would humans do at an asteroid? Is EVA a possibility? The other thing is, after one has been visited, is that enough to then send us on to Mars, or at least the moons of Mars? And these are questions that, that need to be answered if we're going to do the asteroid first route to solar system exploration. Well, what about moon? Is that sustainable? And again, to come back to the proximity. The proximity of the moon allows the public to go outside and see it every night. And that keeps it in the public interest. It's something that is relatively easy, or relatively quick to get to. I won't say easy, but it's relatively quick to get to and therefore quick to get back from. It allows us, because of the materials that are there, it allows us to use it as a test bed for future solar system exploration. And it gives prospects for commercial involvement early. And this is one thing that the Lunar Exploration Analysis Group has been looking at in a lot of detail. We developed the Lunar Exploration Roadmap, and part of that, there was two things. One is that we need to develop an exit strategy of the moon right from the beginning, because we don't want to be stuck there, because we want to do solar system exploration. The other thing is we don't want to abandon everything that is set up on the moon. So we leverage it, and that requires this commercial involvement and commercial on-ramps into the exploration roadmap early and often. So we need to look at the long-term picture of solar system exploration, and that is done by developing capabilities and developing an architecture that is not target-specific, but something that is going to allow us to be very smart in going forward beyond the moon into whether it be to the moons of Mars, to Mars itself, to asteroids, fill in the blank, name your location. So we need to change the attitude about the been there, done that, because we've done very little in terms of the moon. We actually need to think beyond Apollo. Apollo was brilliant, but as we saw, it wasn't sustainable. So we need to think about, well, what is going to make this sustainable? And if you don't learn from history, you're destined to repeat it. So Apollo sortie-type missions told us an awful lot about the moon. But now we need to think beyond those types of missions. As far as the roadmap is concerned, we make the moon part of an integrated multinational solar system exploration program. And basically the next human exploration push should be long-term. It should be sustainable, and this is where we think the ISRU comes in and facilitate this solar system exploration. It is not a moon program, it is not a Mars program, it is a solar system program. So we think that ISRU is the game changer. This is something that we can use local resources on the moon to create life support materials, to create fuel, maybe even to create wealth. But in the short term, it is to sustain life off planet. In the long term, it is to use that to go elsewhere. So we can use the moon then, if we look at the materials that we think are there, to actually use the moon to explore other parts of the solar system. So this is something that's going to enable international cooperation, commercial participation. These are the things that we need to all come to the table in order to get beyond low Earth orbit. So I want to touch a little bit on this roadmap that I've talked about. The Lunar Exploration Roadmap took a number of years to be developed, and the breakdown is the hierarchy as we have themes, goals, objectives, and investigations. There are three themes: science, feed forward, and sustainability. And science, of course, is something that is close to my heart, but the important thing is right from the beginning, we need to look at feed forward. Where are we going afterwards, and how are we going to get there? And that's where the next two themes actually come in. And we think sustainability is the key. And in this roadmap, we have a transition strategy, we have commercial on-ramps, and again, the important thing is international cooperation. So when we first sat down after the request to develop this roadmap, the question we asked is, well, why should we go back? And that's where we had our three themes. We had our science theme, where we would actually look at lunar science on, of, and from the moon. The feed-forward theme was mapped in right at the beginning. And this is something, how can we use the moon to go elsewhere? And then sustainability theme was something that is important because it brings in commerce early. It maps out different routes for doing that. And the important thing with this is that it is a living document, is that we update it the more input that we get, the more missions that go, and the more data that comes back. This is something that gets updated and revised. So I want to focus on the feed-forward theme because this is something where the synergies start to come in. And again, we're going to use the moon to prepare for future missions to Mars and other destinations. The three goals that we have in this is to identify and test technologies on the moon, to enable robotic and human solar system science and exploration, and then to use the moon as a test bed to actually prove these technologies, to prove these operational plans and exploration techniques. But the important thing is to reduce risk. And then the last one down at the bottom there, I'll read it to you if you can't see it, is preparing for missions to other airless bodies. And this is something where the moon, it's the closest airless body. And the purpose here, again, we want to reduce risk, but we want to go beyond the moon. We want to go into the solar system. And the moon, because of its proximity, because of its nature, is something that we can use to enable that. So there were two criteria that we looked at. We looked at the risk reduction value, and then we looked at the lunar platform value. Does this necessarily to be done on the moon? Would it be better done in Antarctica? Would it be done more cost effectively in Antarctica or elsewhere? What about the space station? Could it be done there? So we took a long, hard look at this. This is done by the Lunar Exploration Analysis Group, but we had other people, MEPAG, we've had Small Bodies Assessment Group people involved in developing this particular plan for using the moon to explore the solar system. And again, if you go to the website and look at the roadmap, there are lots of investigations that are there. A lot of them are low priority because they don't meet the two criteria that we've lined out there. So our overarching goals for using the moon to go to airless bodies are laid out here. I'm not going to read through all of them, but they actually echo the synergies that we have between the moon, lunar exploration, and other airless bodies, asteroids, moons of Mars, etc. And these are things that we can develop in our close proximity to Earth, and then reduce the risk, hone the techniques, and send them out to other airless bodies. So I'm going to give you one example. There are many in there. I'm not going to go through each one because we'd be here till the closing ceremony. And I want to look at this one, established dust electrostatic mitigation technologies. This is something that is going to be vital not only for the moon, it's going to be vital for other airless bodies, asteroids, and it's going to be vital for Mars. How do we establish those dust mitigation technologies? So again, we have a time phasing. Early means that we have, these are robotic precursor missions. Late means that we have extended human stay on the lunar surface. But we found that the priority was high throughout each one of these stages because our technologies will develop with the more data that we get back from our exploration strategy. So the moon, we believe, is an exploration asset. It can enable solar system exploration. The synergies between the moon and asteroids will allow facilitation of visiting these other bodies that are not very common or not very easy to get to. And this is where we think the sustainability issue comes in because of the in situ resource utilization. We know that there are resources on the moon. We're starting to understand how to utilize those and extract those. We need to figure out how much is there. We need to get down on the surface, do some prospecting, do some geological field work. And if there was a ride, I may volunteer, but probably a little too heavy for that now. So the ISRU is something that we need to get in the critical path because that's the game changer. It is something that will allow commerce to come in. It will reduce cost of getting off this planet because we don't have to go to Mars. We just have to go to the moon and then go on to Mars. So this looks somewhat self-serving, but we go to the moon. But we don't go to the moon. We go to the moon with an exit strategy. We don't stay at the moon. The synergies that we develop on the moon are then applied elsewhere in the solar system. And again, this is going to be an enabler. This is not a moon program. This is a solar system exploration program. This is a solar system science program. This is a solar system commerce program. Name whatever program you want to call it, but it's solar system at the front. So in conclusion, I think that we shouldn't ignore the moon. I think it is on the critical path, but we need to go in learning from history. We need to go in to understand what makes sustainable solar system exploration. We need to go in with an exit strategy straight away, and then we can leverage our infrastructure with the commercial sector so that these don't get abandoned on the moon when space agencies go off to visit these other places. And just a shameless plug at the end here for the League meeting. It's a Goddard Space Flight Center on October 22nd, 24th. And you're all invited to come along. Thank you very much. "25 minutes for questions." I messed up.
Maybe there are some questions still, which the audience may have. We have some time. We have some.
Well, I have
20 minutes, if you like.
I have one thing from Robert Farquhar down here, who's reminded me that in the L'Enfant Plaza building north, that was where the Lunar Exploration Program office was during Apollo, right? And there is a plaque on that building to go look at it. So there is a bit of history in this location.
Hi. Very interesting presentation. You mentioned this exit strategy when you go to the moon. And if we go back to history, what was the exit strategy when the first European came to America?
The Europeans are still coming to America. I'm here. So. What was the exit strategy? I think they went to Canada. There. I thought it was during the Gulf War as well, but that's.
But the point is, why do we need an exit strategy if we are on the moon? Why not have the moon as part of the Earth sphere?
I'm talking about exit strategy, not abandoning. I mean, the exit strategy is that we can go to the moon, we build up capability, we build up infrastructure, we build up investment, and then we don't want to let it go. So we get stuck at the moon. The important thing is to leverage that, and that's why commercial on-ramps are important, is to allow allow private sector to come in to take over those facilities. So the space agencies can then do what they do best, which is exploration science. Progression strategy. Let's put it in there like that. It's a progression strategy for governments. Yes.
Yeah, Clive. One of the questions, you touched on a little bit, but I was wondering if you'd be a little more, give us a little more detail on what you see as a synergy between, for what the technicians and the engineers want to do with ISRU, and then the potential of science participating in that, and the synergies and the challenges that you see of the two communities working together to do something that neither one could do alone.
Again, I don't think I don't think there's challenges in terms of the communities working together. I mean, if Jerry wants to go and mine regolith, we would understand the volatile input into that regolith, whether it be at the poles or whether it be at the Mars? It's a very interesting science question. Science is not going to drive this. The fact that we need those resources to maintain life off planet, to go elsewhere in the progression strategy, I think that that's going to happen. We go hand in hand. The very fact that there is going to be activity and science comes along for the ride, because science will tell you where those volatile or where those resources are, where they should be, and give you an approximation of how much. That's where the synergy between the science and engineers comes in. And I think that that's going to lead to much better resource utilization when those, and working together it's already started. So I'm rather hopeful for that. Does that answer your question?
So, Clive, I'd like to come back to the issue of the progression strategy.
Okay.
And I think we've seen over the last several years how space station has become a platform for bringing many, many more nations into space than otherwise could possibly have happened. So isn't it likely that after initiating a deeper, more sustainable scientific exploration of the moon, that the moon could then become yet another platform for bringing even more nations farther into space?
Absolutely. I think that's something that would bring in more. It's a very good point. Very good point. I mean, let's use it to bring it in. It's this. I have a question here, and I've got a question down there. This appears enormously expensive. What are your total costs, milestones, and annual costs? Very good question. Very good question. I've not done the business model. I'm a geologist. The important thing is looking at the costs of taking everything from this planet into the solar system. We can get an idea of that by looking at how much station costs to maintain every year. We now got a game changer with Dragon, but then how do we then say, okay, we've got to go up, we're going to look at developing ISRU. This is not going to happen in a year. We have to find out where those are, what the costs are of actually developing that. And there have been some business plans shown here, or at least mentioned here, as to how profitable that would be. And that's the other thing, it's the creation of wealth. How profitable is that going to be for the private sector to do? That's the question mark in the plan. This is not perfect, not at all. I've not done the business plan. It needs to be done. Everything appears, if we're going to an asteroid, that appears to be rather expensive as well. If we're going to go to Mars, we've just seen in the Planetary Science Decadal Survey, a robotic sample return mission is at the moment prohibitively expensive. And that's a robotic sample return. You put humans in there. So what's the game changer? And that's, don't take everything off the planet. Pick it up somewhere else.
You almost addressed my question, answering the previous question, but not quite. Therefore, I'll ask my question. You indicated several benefits for going to the moon, including to use the moon as a stepping stone to go to other places.
Right.
And these days, really what matters is only cost. Nothing else really is that important, but the lowest cost. The question is that whether going to the moon in order to get ready to go someplace else, that would be at a lower cost if you skip the moon and directly go someplace else. I understand that going to the moon may have other advantages too, but I'm not discussing them. I'm just focusing on using the moon as a stepping stone to go to other places. Whether the moon will provide us with the lowest cost or going directly to wherever we want to go, that may be the lower cost. Thank you.
I think you need to involve risk there as well. I don't think it's just cost, it's risk. We've become very risk averse since Apollo, and we need to reduce the risk. And that's something that the moon as a test bed, and not for everything, and that's the whole point. It's not everything that the moon is useful for when you want to go elsewhere. And very, very aware of that. but what is the value of the moon if you want to go to an airless body? I try to outline that today. What is the value of the moon if you want to go to Mars? Very different places, but there are certain things that you can reduce the risk of going to Mars by using the moon. So.
Just my opinion, but there are 18 of the 24 people that have already reached the moon, and I think as far as the United States, in its search for leading the world, can make very good use by doing the infrastructure all around the moon, but not on the surface. On the surface, the NASA Ames International Lunar Research Park effort is one of assembling items to be at the south pole of the moon, or whatever we choose as the main base. And the process of assembling that from habitats at L1 and L2 gives us the practice, develops the procedures to do the same thing on the surface of Mars from Phobos or Deimos. And I think the asteroid missions following the early robotic exploration of asteroids should be the greatest place of leadership, rather than going back to the moon, spending a lot of money. The interplanetary deep space habitat obviously makes a good landing object on a vacuum object like Phobos or Deimos. And it could be used certainly as a long duration occupancy on the moon. So that habitat can be marketed to those people who expect to spend a lot of time for national interests. The 60s and 70s was a national interest of the U.S. To be first on the moon, and we invested a lot in it, and we'd like to maintain that leadership. Thank you.
Okay. And I think having assets around the moon then sort of smacks of using the resources of the moon to enable what you just said. Why don't we just do this?
Okay. Well, in regards to cost, just to put this meeting in some context, right now in the world there's a lot of discussion about other things that cost a huge amount of money that aren't related to space and technology, namely banking crises, things like this, which have gobbled up tremendous amounts of funds in the past several years. And often those are presented not as what's the cost of doing this, but what are the consequences of not. It's presented as, well, this is an urgent thing to which we must respond. And it seems as though the idea of actually having a concept of a future towards which we're striving has disappeared to such an extent that programs which cost, I'd say, nothing. The Apollo program cost nothing. The paybacks far exceeded the expense. So with some of these missions where the proposal you have, other competing ones, really none of them would cost anything if they're run properly. So I was wondering what you think in terms of what this says about, if you have any thoughts in terms of the social context of this or the political context. I'm curious to hear them.
All right. Well, again, I think that if you are going to sell this politically and to the general public, I think you have to show what the return is, and you can use Apollo as a good example for that. But I think the important thing is the follow-on costs. And you're looking at, the question came up earlier on about this sounds really expensive. Yeah, it's initially it will be really expensive. But this is where people who have bigger brains than me need to look at and figure out what the costs actually are in terms of not only establishing it, but what are then the returns, potential returns going to be once you do that following the commercial on-ramp activity that is going to be there. What are the returns going to be in terms of actual hard dollars? What are the returns going to be in terms of science? What are the returns going to be in technology development? I've listed a few things here in the talk with regards to the technology development aspect. What do we need to develop in order to go forward? I haven't looked at what are the spin-offs potentially for back here, and we heard that earlier on at this conference. What are the spin-offs going to be for humanity down still on this rock here? And that's something that we still need to look at, absolutely. But I think there's a number of studies that could be done to actually put a little bit more fidelity on that. But I think the technology benefits, jobs, and that's the other thing, jobs. Especially in this economic climate, no matter where you are, it's jobs. How is this going to create jobs?
Thank you for your presentation this morning. Just some comments and then your reaction, not really questions. The first is, I think public support is a myth. I think that's unimportant. That's a separate discussion in its own right, beyond your time frame now. But the thing I wanted to comment on more importantly is, listening to the heads of agencies the other morning, I thought the most engaging comments were made by the Russian, Mr. Popovkin, his desire to return to the moon. And I think that's something that needs to be built upon. I think his thoughts of focusing on the moon, near Earth, asteroids, Mars, that's for later on. And I think building that partnership with the Russians, who clearly want to do it, at least through his mouth, and the erosion of support in Putin, that scientific relationship will continue whether they go into a different state, which they will. But I think that's something that the scientific community here needs to build stronger bonds and use their brain trust and start with that. Just your reaction.
Better think before I speak here. My reaction is that focus on the moon is, in terms of my own personal opinion, I think it's great. But what's the big picture? What is the goal of focusing on the moon? Is it to stay at the moon? I hope not. I want, if we're going to focus on the moon in the near term, we have to remember the long-term goal, and that's to get beyond the moon. I mean, we're getting beyond low Earth orbit. We focused on low Earth orbit. Now we need to look at that progression and build in timelines for the progression strategy. It's much better than exit strategy. But progression strategy is important there. So I think the ISEG, in my opinion, the ISEG needs to look at that big picture. That is the big picture. Where do we start? What are the pathways? What are the milestones that need to be achieved in order to get to the big picture? That's something ISEG, I think, can really leverage and push forward to actually galvanize that international cooperation. What is the big picture? It's solar system exploration. How are we going to get there? We're dealing with pathways now. We've got a bunch of destinations. The ultimate goal is Mars. But what does that mean? We have one visit, we have a couple of footprints, we turn around and come back. Is that it? What's the goal? Is that the goal? Is that sustainable? I don't know. These are the questions I think that we need to discuss. What is the goal? The goal of going to the moon is to go elsewhere. All right, where do you want to go? Well, we've got some ideas. Ultimate goal is Mars. What does that mean?
The general ambiguities of purpose, sequence, and progression in our exploration roadmaps and the real definition of the decision of what we do is difficult to define in the absence of understanding what the market driver is. The market driver is what will allow us to bring in the most revenue for the most optimum investment. Using and utilizing the moon as the first stage of a market-led expansion will naturally allow the evolution of science, exploration, and dozens, if not hundreds, of other businesses along the way. The question of whether there is then a progression strategy beyond the moon, across the moon, and in cislunar space almost becomes a no-brainer. It will happen just because of the entrepreneurial and business drive of the general economy that the whole world is based on. So if you look at what the market objectives are, look at where you can make money, and look at the business streams that can arise from it, everything else will naturally follow on.
I feel better. This is why why it's good to have people like Jim here that understand the markets, because that's where I go to get vegetables. But yeah, right, hydroponic. Yeah. But the important thing is and this is Jim's talk about Shackleton Energy Company's business plan earlier in the week. I found quite engaging because, number one, I understood it. Number two, it shows that the private sector is thinking about this, and we have to create the market. I think that's what it is. It's to create the market with those commercial on-ramps, to bring them in to see where how much money can be made, if any money can be made.
Yeah, I would just like to say that we have seen in your talk and in many other talks that there are so many roadmaps. There is so much work done, in particular by the scientific community in the last 20 years and even longer. We know what we want to do scientifically, we know where we want to go, and it is not, I think, always reinventing the wheel. There are so many wonderful roadmaps, and one you have just explained today, that it is, we should really use and exploit all the synergies between these roadmaps and actually go ahead. It's not anymore of templating, it is of implementing. And this conference is actually one of the only conferences, and I'm at conferences every 2 weeks somewhere, which really unites all stakeholders. And this is the future. You really need to have all stakeholders on one table and start to implement all the things what we already know. Mm-hmm. And when we have a basis, we know where we can exploit worldwide expertise, we know what we want to do, and it's not only about market, because whatever you want to market will be driven by science, because you don't know where to go and you don't know what you want to market if you don't know the science behind it and what your object and destination has to offer. So it is really an effect, and I think this conference is just a perfect one of the first steps which unites those stakeholders, and they have to sit on a table and continue the dialogue and start to implement.
Amen. But I think there are a lot of roadmaps, and in regard to the one that I briefly talked about today and talked about yesterday, this is something that did take into account the previous work that had been done, at least in terms of the moon. I think the important thing is to, as you say, how do you implement that? And that's something in terms of the lunar exploration roadmap we looked at last year, and that is on our website, and it comes down to the game changer. And we thought the best way to implement the lunar exploration roadmap was with in situ resource utilization. Put it front and center. Let's not pussyfoot around it anymore. Let's just go do it. And we felt that was the best way to implement the lunar exploration roadmap, but it also will take us beyond the moon. So I agree. I mean, it comes down to money. It comes down to political will. And I just say let's do something. So, but we need to implement it.
Thanks, Clive. As you may guess, I wanted to ask a deep and meaningful about dust. You mentioned about learning from history, and of course we don't learn from history. And we keep repeating it, but we don't learn from it. On dust, it could be argued, I think, that one of the biggest failures that was unnecessary on Apollo was not forecasting and implementing dust remedial measures. You had 6 missions, 30 months apart, and there was basically no improvement over that period. Now, it's all very well to talk about electrostatic mechanisms and so on, and sure, you can do things. But I want to get to the fundamentals with your roadmaps. The reason for that lack of preparedness was a culture which was caused by the predecessors, by the forerunner explorers, Surveyor in particular, in which the surveyor did not sink out of sight, deep in the dust. So the engineers said, okay, dust will not pose a life-threatening thing, we will forget about dust. And they did. The physicists had predicted in 1962 electrostatic dust and all the rest of it at the Iowa conference. Chuck Sonnets, they had a thought of taking a battery up there. How do you cope with all your roadmaps and avoid total confusion for that very human failing to learn from history?
Well, the very trite answer is learn from it. I think with regard to dust, it is recognized that dust is something that is a hazard. It is recognized not only for human health, but it's also recognized for mechanisms for robotic explorers. In terms of robotic explorers, we have history from the Russians, or Soviets as they were then. It was the Lunar rovers that one of them lasted 3 months on the lunar surface. The important thing is to, as you say, learn from it. We have knowledge from Apollo that I can be very crass, is we're going to lose it. We have to learn from it. We have to build on it. And I think that that's something that the roadmaps do take into account. There are many investigations, at least in the lunar exploration roadmap, that mitigate dust, look to mitigate dust, and with regards to seals. And that's the important thing. We do have to learn from it. Otherwise, we will go nowhere.
Can I comment on that? The reason is, years ago I met with Leonard Jaffe, who ran the surveyor program out of JPL, and I happened to get his archive, and also Bob Steinbacher, who was the assistant chief scientist on the project. They told me that the project was stripped down budget-wise, that they had experiments to look into dust, and they wanted to refute Tommy Gold's theory of fairy castle. And even after we landed on the moon, Tommy Gold was saying, came up with another justification for fairy castle, which I think is what you're alluding to. But it was purely a political decision to de-instrumentize the mission, which probably would have addressed this question. So it was just budget.
Precursors, yeah.
Well, I think we're getting a bit in a time problem now.
Yeah.
So if you can keep that short, please.
Between dust on the moon and dust on asteroids.
What was the comparison between the dust on moon?
What is known about dust on asteroids?
What is known about dust on asteroids was the follow-up and precursor mission. Again, I can't answer that one. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Neal, and thanks a lot also that you left such a lot of time for questions leading to very interesting discussions. No, I think that was perfect. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would invite you again to join me into another big round of applause for our keynote speaker. We are now coming to our next plenary event, the 5th plenary session, which is titled Enabling a Political Consensus, and it's my pleasure to call on stage now our distinguished panelists, Mr. Augusto Gonzalez, Head of the Space Policy and Coordination Unit of the European Commission, Mr. Hirofumi Katase, Deputy Secretary General Councillor, Secretariat of Strategic Headquarters for Space Policy from Japan, and Mr. Ken Hodgkins, Director Office of Space and Advanced Technologies, US Department of State. The plenary will be moderated by a person who is very well known to the whole community, Mr. Jeffrey Hoffman, Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Mr. Hoffman, please.
Right, well, I'll do a brief introduction before I take my seat. The theme of the panel is enabling a political consensus, but let's be honest, what we're really here to talk about is money, lots of money, public money. With the exception of a few entrepreneurs in the audience, all of us have come here to basically explore the solar system using other people's money and public money. And whenever you are asking for public money on the order of tens or hundreds of billions of dollars, politics gets involved. And that's what we're here to talk about. We've done a lot of discussion about consensus among space agencies, among scientists, but we need to talk about the people who can ultimately make these things happen, and that is the political leaders in the governments. We want to explore what mechanisms are available to create political support and the consensus that's going to be necessary to achieve the international collaboration that everybody here agrees. I haven't heard any dissenting opinions that if we're going to do these things, we need international cooperation. What we need to go beyond is just the cooperation among the agencies. We all have, as an example, the unfortunate situation with ExoMars, where we thought we had an agreement between NASA and ESA, but we didn't have the Office of Management and Budget as part of that agreement, and they're the people who control the purse strings, and we all know the consequences. And so to start exploring this, it actually started as a European initiative, and of course the Europeans have been working at achieving intergovernmental consensus for many years as part of the formation of the European Union. There was a meeting earlier this year in Lucca, Italy, to discuss originally the dialogue between the European Union and the European Space Agency, but it really evolved from a Eurocentric to a more international focus, and the US has agreed to host a follow-on meeting in this country next year. And so what we would like is to hear from our speakers, first of all, short statements about their perspectives on achieving political consensus at the governmental level, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions. So I would like to start with Mr. Hirofumi Katase, who you heard a very brief introduction. I'll just say that he is directly attached to the Prime Minister's office, is intimately connected with space policy, has held many other positions in the Japanese government, and with that, Katase-san.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction. So here I would like to talk about the situation on the surrounding space exploration in Japan. And also, finally, I would like to present my view as to how we should proceed to get to the political consensus. 5 points. The first point is the overall situation of Japanese space policy. As you might know, the law called Basic Act of Space Policy was established in 2008 by the bipartisan consensus. And this law elevated the space policy to one of the major national strategies. At the same time, as Japan is facing a very severe budget deficit situation, there is a very strong requirement to streamline and prioritize the spending on space programs, even though the government managed to keep the level of total annual budget for space, including the supplementary budget, for the past few years. Second point, how the space exploration, such as space science and manned missions, are ranked in Japanese space policy. The Basic Act of Space expanded the focus of the space policy from the pure science to civil and security use of space, and also the maintenance of national industry base. However, space explorations is one of the major pillars of space policy, And as a matter of fact, the government decided on the extension of ISS program, even though the program constitutes more than 13% of the total Japanese space budget, which is the biggest percentage among ISS partners. Third, how space exploration is valued in Japan. Though, of course, each space exploration programs is evaluated mainly from science perspectives, there is an understanding that they also have tangible effects of stirring up the spirit and imagination of the nation and the world. And this point became even more clear on the return of Hayabusa mission from an asteroid, of which 3 movies, including one by Hollywood, were produced within a year. And there is also understanding that if successfully organized, the space exploration programs could have a positive value in improving international posture. As in the case of ISS, through the creation of confidence among institutions, as well as the creation of a sense of a bond as a single human being among ordinary people. And this point, I think, is very important, even especially in Asia, where China and India are increasing their space activity, and also South Koreans are, in a lesser extent. And it's very important to avoid the creation of a very intensive sense of space competition to secure the use of this space for ourselves. Fourth, what will be our space exploration policy in general toward the future? Given the 3 points that I described, Japan will continue to conduct space exploration programs, mainly based on its own merits, but taking into consideration to develop elemental technology such as transport or sample return, for example, which would enable Japan to make a substantial technological contribution to the future international space exploration programs, such as to Mars missions, once it is launched. And finally, let me describe how we see the tasks that lay ahead for us to come into some political international consensus. We realize that the ISECG did a very great job among the space institutions to define the options as well as its merit of the international space exploration programs. But what is necessary is to put this into a bigger international politics framework to define what would be the specific merits of international, in the context of international politics, not only from the specifics, the point of the technological or science merit. And in doing this, what is important is to realize that there are, I should say, some competitors in that context. For example, even in space, even in Japan, there are some people who advocate the satellite-based solar power systems as even more attractive projects to stir up a sense of international bond, for example, or improve the confidence among the international, the national space institutions. And also, if we go beyond, or if we see beyond the space, there, for example, can be a symbolic medical project, for example, tackling, for example, the cancers. But and defining the specific merit of space exploration vis-a-vis all other competing projects, I think will be also important. And what is important is finally the leaders of the major nations take the lead as a way to bring a sort of new sense of cooperation or new sense of bond into this multipolar world, utilizing such a symbolic program. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'd like to hear next from Ken Hodgkins, who is has been with the State Department since 1987, and as you heard, he's now Director of the Office of Space and Advanced Technologies in the Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science, and that's responsible for cooperation in both civil and commercial space, as well as high technology, including the ISS, satellite navigation systems, nanotechnology. He also represents the United States on COPUOS, the UN body, and before coming to the State Department, he was Director of International Affairs at the National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service in the Department of Commerce. So, Mr. Hodgkins.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about my experience, my office's experience in large-scale science and space cooperative ventures, because there are some lessons that I think we can learn in terms of how you build a political consensus for exploration. And there are a couple of things that I think we have to bear in mind as we look at this. First of all, are we talking about a really big idea like the International Space Station, or a series of small programs that all come together to form a whole? And right now, through the ISIG process, which I think is a very, very useful process and has done some very good work, it's taking an approach of looking at exploration as bringing together various countries that are pursuing some of their own interests and then somehow merging that into a concept. But the question is, how are you going to grab the attention of the policymakers, not only here in the United States but abroad, to embrace this idea that their space budgets should be taking, or a big part of their space budget should be devoted to this concept of space exploration. The reality is that the space agencies and the political decision makers are separated in many other countries. That is, the space agencies are pursuing their priorities, which obviously are priorities of the government, but then there are the government level folks that still have to be brought into the equation. And here in the United States, it's a little bit different because we have the national space policy. The whole idea of exploration has been vetted at the presidential level, and we're fairly confident that this is the direction that we want to take as a nation. The question is, how do we bring our partners along in that same process? And it's just a matter of timing. When is the best time to do this? And basically, what we need is a framework for a sustained effort over decades that allows us to have a mutual confidence in our ability to deliver. And so you look at the question of what processes do we want to use to get to that point. So today we have the ISIG. We also have the LUCA conference that Jeff had mentioned earlier. That conference or series of conferences is designed to try to begin the process of sensitizing policymakers to the value of exploration and the need to make a long-term commitment. And we will be having a follow-on meeting from LUCA here in the United States sometime perhaps in 2013. What's interesting about exploration, unlike some of the other projects that I'll talk about, is that up front we've concluded that we need international cooperation. Now, in the case of the space station, you'll recall that in the State of the Union address in 1984, President Reagan announced that the United States would build a space station. It wasn't until months later that the decision was made to try to go and bring in international partnerships, and then that took another year before reaching an agreement in principle during the 1985 G7 summit. So for me, it's interesting that up front we realize we need other partners. So the question is, how do we bring about the requisite political consensus that exploration is something that we need to pursue? Now, in the case of the space station, we used the presidential level summit process. At that time, it was the G7. Today, it's the G8. We also have the G20, which is a broader group, including emerging economic powers. So we have that process that we certainly could use. In the case of the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER, this is another project that my office is involved in, and it's a 30-year project to demonstrate the feasibility of fusion. And we're building a major facility in Katase, France. We have 6 or 7 partners, and we created an international organization, a formal international organization, to oversee the building of this facility. Now, this was not, we did not initiate this project through some kind of presidential level meetings. It was more bringing together groups of scientists who validated the possibility that we could demonstrate the feasibility of fusion, and eventually reaching that scientific consensus, we were able to get a political level decision made in the various countries that are part of ITER to negotiate a very formal, binding international agreement. Now, under this particular agreement, what's interesting is that if a party is unable to fulfill its obligations, in-kind obligations, that party pays the international organization the money that they would otherwise have used for that contribution for the international organization to then buy the in-kind contributions that the party to the agreement could not provide. So what that agreement does is it sustains the project and makes sure it can move forward even if one of the parties is unable to meet its obligations. So from our perspective, moving forward, we take the work of ISIG, decide when is the best time to get the political level endorsement that we believe we need, and then to look at what types of cooperative mechanisms would best be suited for a long-term commitment to space exploration, whether it's to the Moon, Mars, or to an asteroid. I guess with that, I'll conclude and look forward to any questions you might have.
Okay, well, there were certainly plenty of themes there which will give us adequate food for moving on. And finally, Mr. Augusto Gonzalez is the head of the Space Policy and Coordination Group in the Directorate General for Enterprise and Industry of the European Union. He's worked with the European Commission since 1989 in many different areas, including education, human resources, financial management, and now, of course, space policy. And it was in Europe, in Lucca, that this whole enterprise got underway that we're discussing today, so I think it's appropriate to let you have the final initial word.
Thank you very much. Just let me thank you first, the host and the organizers of the panel, for inviting the European Union to participate in this policy discussion on exploration. Let me start by underlining that for the European Union, space policy, including space exploration, this policy is an instrument to achieve its ultimate goal of ensuring the well-being of its peoples. That's enshrined in the treaty. Citizens' well-being depends today directly on space activities, communications, transport, weather forecasts, the monitoring of environment, public and civil security. All of those rely on satellites. But citizens' well-being depends on our society's capacity to ensure sustainable, smart, and inclusive growth. Space exploration is an instrument for growth, and this is something that I would like to underline throughout my presentation. Space exploration generates knowledge, new products, and new forms of industrial cooperation. Space exploration is a driving force for innovation and contributes to the competitiveness of our industry and to the development of the knowledge-based society. It contributes to growth and job creation. Space exploration requires leading-edge technologies and creative solutions, which in turn require new forms of industrial collaboration and lead to further industrial developments. The impact of these new forms of industrial collaboration and the development of space exploration technologies is not confined to the space sector itself. There are significant spin-off and spillover effects on non-space sectors, which are a source of further economic growth and direct benefits for citizens. Targeted expenditure in space exploration can trigger major innovations in sectors such as health, access to renewable energy, and water management, just to mention a few. And all of these are areas critical to human well-being. Space exploration achievements are also inspiring and motivating for the next generations to embrace science and technology careers, and thus enhancing competencies in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics among pupils and students. Now, we live in difficult economic times, particularly in Europe, which has been hit hard by the financial crisis. Europe is taking determined action and making very difficult policy choices to deal with the current crisis. Austerity measures lead to budget cuts, not least in the space domain. But austerity alone is not enough. We need and we have a growth strategy to get out of the current situation and give hope to young generations which are suffering most from recession. Space exploration can play a role and plays a role in such a growth strategy. We have to convey to the public opinion, to the politicians if you wish, that the space exploration is not a luxury, and that by investing in it, we're investing in innovation and knowledge on which our future economic recovery and sustainable growth depends. Besides the consequences of economic crisis, the world in general faces other global challenges such as climate change and health threats. These challenges demand that the pursuit of space exploration be also considered in the light of the global socioeconomic benefits that can be derived from exploration activities. In Europe, there is a consensual view that any global scenario for space exploration should include the following main components: enabling technologies, space transportation, space infrastructure, and robotic missions. There is also a consensus that Europe's thematic priorities for space exploration should be automation and robotics, novel energy production and storage, including nuclear, advanced propulsion, and life support systems. Now, these components and priorities are obviously essential for the future development of space exploration, but they can also have a direct applications outside the space sector and therefore are in tune with the notion that space exploration should respond to socio-economic challenges. Now the question is, how can we reconcile budget austerity and the need to continue to invest in space exploration? Well, as you said a moment ago, international collaboration is part of the answer. International collaboration is not a new idea in space exploration, but today is certainly more important than ever. Europe notably through member states individually and through the European Space Agency, has a long record of achievements which result from its collaboration with leading nations in space exploration. Europe believes that the future space exploration is an endeavor that possibly no country could undertake on its own. Cooperation is now a prerequisite. This is the reason why the European Union, together with the European Space Agency, organized 3 successive international high-level conferences for policy dialogue on space exploration. The latest was indeed held in Lucca, Italy, on 10th of November 2011. And the next one, it has been already said, will be hosted by the United States. The idea of this international high-level fora for policy discussion stems from the recognition that space exploration is not only a scientific, but also a political endeavor. The objective of such policy discussion is to facilitate that international partners progressively converge towards a global vision for future space exploration that delivers scientific, societal, and economic benefits and identifies areas and principles for international cooperation. The policy-level discussion should not duplicate, but rather provide inspiration to existing technical and programmatic space exploration fora. The declaration, adopted by all participants at the Lucca conference, represents a major step towards a political consensus in space exploration. It recognizes the value of space exploration to, inter alia, address global challenges through the use of innovative technology, inspire society, and especially the younger generation, and enable economic expansion and new business opportunities. It also recognizes the benefit from a continued and structured high-level policy dialogue on future space exploration, that could lead to greater cooperation in areas such as access to space, innovation in space technologies, the utilization of the current and possible future low Earth orbit infrastructure, and human and robotic presence beyond LEO. Ladies and gentlemen, the title of this panel is Enabling Political Consensus. The international conferences demonstrated that there seems to be an emerging political consensus around a few key notions. The first is that the space exploration is not only a scientific, but also a political endeavor that needs to be closely connected to socioeconomic challenges. The second is that space exploration need not be a single space project, but instead comprise multiple collaborative missions and projects which can involve many established and emerging actors. The third is perhaps that the present global context provides opportunities for positive collaboration, and that it is important to have a forum for policy discussion to complement these technical and programmatic discussions. The next big step is, of course, for the political consensus to crystallize and lead to new, concrete, ambitious collaborative missions and projects which can contribute to innovation, growth, and benefits for citizens. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And thank you to all the panel members for their contributions. And as hoped, this leaves us almost a half hour for questions. I've received a few questions, but you all know the drill, so fill out the forms and we will try to address the questions. I also have a few questions that I developed myself, and I would like to start with Katase-san to follow up on your comment, and I think this is very significant, that there is a tremendous growth in space activity all over Asia now. In the past, Japan's international cooperation in space has mainly been directed towards the West, with the United States. How do you see the new Asian space programs affecting Japanese international cooperation and policy?
As you know, Japan has been taking a lead for the Asian International Space Corporation through the organization of the so-called APR-SAF. This is the body where all the relevant institutions, not only in Asia but also in Pacific, and also I think ESA is also participating to get together and develop the cooperative program, such as, for example, Sentinel Asia. And I think this will enable the new emerging Asian space countries, such as China, India, and South Korea, to incorporate their effort into the Asian cooperation. So I think the rise of these countries will even sort of increase the importance of the Japanese organizing such a forum. So this is a positive aspect. Another aspect is that, as I described, some sense of the competition, because the other side of the space program becoming a sort of source of international cooperation is that it can become a source of enhancing the national pride or national position. And I think this, as I said, will have a risk of sort of escalating the competition within Asia as a sort of a competition of the national position itself. And of course, this is to some extent a good thing to develop the space technology itself. But I think the downside is that this will risk the safety of the use of space through, for example, the creation of debris, for example. This is giving us a sort of new task of developing the international cooperation, including all these Asian countries, to develop some sort of the international rules, which is a new area of the important cooperation.
Thank you. Oh, lots coming in. Several questions relating to the relationship of the European Union and the European Space Agency, which continues to be an evolving story. What are the long-term aspirations of the European community, the European Union, with respect to policy? There is a question, actually, if we can expect to see a line item for space in the EU budget in the near future. Actually, I think with the Galileo program, there already are some line item budgets, but maybe you can address the general question of in future cooperation. And just as an example, for the space station, we had an interagency agreement among the various space agencies, but then finally, we needed an intergovernmental agreement which was signed by a large number of European countries. Do you see us ever getting to a stage where the European Union can sign a international agreement for space cooperation?
Thank you for the question. I'm afraid I don't have a crystal ball to answer it, but I think that you were referring to the relation between the EU and ESA. I mean, ESA needs no presentation, has a long record of achievements, and the EU is more of a novice in the space domain. The treaty of the last revision of the treaties, so-called Lisbon Treaty, conferred to the European Union a clear competence in space. Who conferred? Well, member states. Member states that decided that the European Union, because of the nature of its policy, because of the nature of its goals, needed to have the capacity to undertake action in the space domain to help achieve its ultimate objectives, which I referred to in my presentation. So clearly, the European Union is a new player, and it has the luck to have the European Space Agency, which is a world-class organization on which the European Union can rely to implement projects such as Galileo. So there is a very intense, a very fluid relationship between the European Union and the European Space Agency, even though they are different organizations. I mean, they fulfill different purposes. I mean, the European Union has no ambition of becoming itself some sort of a specialized space agency. Not at all. We already have an agency in Europe. So I think that what we are likely to see in the future is to see the links and the relationship between the European Union and the space agency to become ever stronger, but without the ambition of one replacing or duplicating what the other is doing. I mean, the roles are fully complementary. And in relation to the last question, yes, of course, there is a budget line. There are actually several budget lines. Right now we have Galileo, we have a budget line for Galileo, we have a budget line for the Global Monitor for Environment and Security Project, but we also have a significant budget for space research. And while there is a bit of a policy discussion regarding the future funding of GMES, the intention is that certainly there will be lines for Galileo and space research in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. For Mr. Hodgkins, perhaps a hardball this time, because we're all aware that there is one major space power that is not represented at this conference, and that is China. And there's two questions related to that. The overriding one is that is it possible to conceive of a true international cooperation in space exploration and a global strategy without China? And specifically, given the current situation in the United States, where by law NASA is not allowed even to buy a cup of coffee for a visiting Chinese scientist, how can we really get involved in international cooperation when a big player is not allowed to come to the table?
Well, I mean, everyone knows we have a very complicated situation with China. I mean, obviously, it depends on what countries want to do what, and it's not a foregone conclusion that you need every single spacefaring nation involved in every single project. I mean, we don't do that today. So I think obviously China has capabilities that would complement future exploration, but for the United States, we have a fundamental problem right now, which is that we can't engage with them directly on some of these questions. So I think the challenge today is how you have the ISIG process go forward that makes a technical case for exploration, and then what do you need to do at a political level to engage all potential partners. And again, until there are change in legislation, NASA's options are very, very limited in terms of bringing in China for bilateral work.
Okay. Definitely not an easy question to deal with in
I
the current political climate.
I wish I had an answer for
but
it.
certainly one which is worth addressing. Katase-san, I have a question which is somewhat cultural in nature. A couple of years ago at the European Space Policy Institute, we had a meeting of astronauts and former astronauts talking about rationale for space exploration. And two of our Japanese colleagues brought up the point that First of all, they had a very hard time translating exploration into Japanese, into the Japanese language, and that when they spoke with public as they went around the country, they found that their countrymen did not respond to the concept of exploration the way perhaps we do here in the United States, where it's part of our cultural heritage. You mentioned the excitement that has come about from the Hayabusa mission. I wonder if you could comment on this general cultural attitude towards exploration and whether you see a possibility that that might change in the future.
Well, frankly, I cannot see the difference of culture related to space exploration because maybe I don't know very much about Western culture. But I think as I said, there is a very positive view on space exploration among Japanese public because there is a sort of a consensus that aiming to go to the outer space, for example, to stir up some sort of the imagination and also the challenging spirit of Japanese people. I think this sense was even more enhanced by the success of the Hayabusa mission. Actually, I don't think there is much difference. But what is important is that at the same time, policymakers perceive that such excitement is not enough to justify a big space program, especially under the global budget situation. So I think besides such a sort of the public PR purposes, I think we need to come up with some sort of the good reasoning, such as I said, in the context of changing a sort of international posture through some symbolic project, such as space exploration.
Thank you. For Ken Hodgkins, two questions related to the upcoming forum on intergovernmental cooperation and enabling a political consensus, which, as you referred to, is being planned for probably 2013. Could you give some ideas of how that's being prepared for? What are some of the key issues you'd like to address? And in particular, are there things, you referred to the ITER cooperation, are there some direct analogies there from which we might learn about cooperation in space intergovernmentally?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the follow-on conference to Luca, we're really just in the preliminary stages right now of planning for it, but it would be an intergovernmental meeting that would look at the results from the last 3 meetings. I mean, even the results from this conference could certainly be factored into what we do. But I guess what I'd like to touch on in kind of a different way here is that for my purposes, the case for space exploration is being made and needs to be made. And so where I fit in, or my office or the State Department fits in, is to look at what types of mechanisms do we use to reach this what we're referring to as a political consensus, and then what kinds of international frameworks do we need to sustain what could be a decades-long enterprise? Do we need binding international agreements? Do we need an intergovernmental organization? Do we use the space station management framework as an example? And so when I look at this, I take it as a given that yes, everyone supports space exploration, and these are the types of things that the various countries want to do. What kinds of mechanisms do we need to put into place? And ITER, I raised ITER because that is kind of a unique approach where we have a large-scale project that has in-kind contributions being made by countries, but we created an international organization that is in charge of managing the entire project, subject to the consensus of the member states of ITER in a council in the form of a council. So there are many examples that we can draw on for organizing ourselves once the decision has been made by the space agencies that yes, this is something we want to do, and yes, we need to make a commitment to one another on a long-term basis. And that's where the LUCA process and follow-on to LUCA will play a role. And conferences like these also help to inform us as to what we might need in the future.
Actually, you made the statement that we're all in agreement about the importance of space exploration. There are a few questions here questioning that assumption, which I'd like maybe the three of you to address, and that is the fact, well, for instance, a speaker yesterday mentioned the fact that space may have been the new frontier in the 1960s, but there are many new frontiers today: nanotechnology, clean energy, the internet. I mean, the list goes on. Is there a possibility that governments will actually lose their interest in supporting space activities, particularly if the economic situation does not improve? And since Europe is probably the most hard hit at the moment, maybe Mr. Gonzalez, you could comment on this.
Yeah, in my presentation, I mean, I'm not sure that the perception amongst policymakers is that yes, they're all in favor of space exploration. I think that the case has to be made. Those that work in the space policy domain, of course, believe that space exploration is important. But at least from a European Union perspective, it is extremely important that we make the case that space exploration is not a luxury. That is something that is useful and that delivers benefits for citizens. That is provides a stimulus for innovation and therefore for competitiveness, and competitiveness leads to growth and job creation. I think that this equation is extremely important today. We need to, obviously, there are many other needs. There are budget cuts, but I think that the responsibility is on us to make sure that economy, citizens will benefit from it. Science, of course, will benefit from it. That goes without saying. But when people are preoccupied with economy, finances, budgets, and so forth, you have to demonstrate how something which is kind of so far from the ground is going to have an impact on economies and citizens' life. And I think that we can prove it. We can prove it, and that's the insofar as we can prove it, there will be support for space exploration. And again, nobody, they certainly not within the European Union, has enough money to undertake grand space exploration projects on its own, which is again the reason why this is a good time to explore possibilities for international collaboration. So because times are hard, the opportunity is good to try collaboration.
Katase-san, a Japanese perspective?
Yes, I think in Japan the importance of space activity itself is increasing, but it's mainly in the area of within the geo-orbit, like the communication, the navigation system, or the surveillance, the disaster preventions. And frankly, I think when it comes to the exploration, for example, to Mars, I think the competition with other projects are becoming intense because it's very hard to prove the economic or other benefit of sending, for example, people to Mars, frankly speaking, as compared with, for example, some possible breakthrough in nanotechnology, as you described. However, what I'd like to say is that the space exploration still retains some sort of qualitative merit of stirring up the sort of the spirit of human beings. And also, as I said, if successful, we can create such a sort of spirit encompassing the national border. So what I think is that in order for the political consensus making to be successful, I think it's important to focus and define such a merit. And then I think the space exploration will also get some sort of priority over other so-called frontier projects.
And Tim?
Yeah, well, my point when I said that there seems to be an agreement on the importance of exploration, I guess the point I was making is within the United States, we've had this debate. Mm-hmm. We've had the debate at the highest levels in the form of policy pronouncements from the president, from the NASA administrator, and in Congress. So, from my perspective, the question is not so much making the case within the United States on the importance of exploration. It is how do we help our potential partners make the same case at the same levels, and at what stage do we? At what stage does the United States provide the leadership to bring that political consensus to a head in other countries, and how do we go about doing that? And that's, from my perspective, the real question, quite aside from the technical and the programmatic issues, is if we see cooperation as being fundamental to our own national goals in exploration, how do we bring about that cooperation? And what we're hearing today is that there still needs to be a case made with some of our more important partners within their own political structure. And so how can we help make that case?
Thank you. I don't know if we have a roving microphone. I have a request from Jean-Pierre Swing to ask a question or make a comment in person. It's okay with me. No, here the mic's coming.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little comment to what Mr. Gonzalez said. In the frame of the European Commission, there is a space advisory group that was at the basis of writing up a document in 2010 on exploration, and I'm very glad that Mr. Gonzalez used some excerpts of that thing in his presentation. Now, in 2011, we started writing, actually there are 3 members of the Space Advisory Group in this room. We wrote a document about space in H2020, which means the next framework program, 2014-2020. And this was based on 3 major pillars. One is space exploration, solar system and beyond. Then there's science and exploration. Then the 3rd pillar is cross-cutting activities with education, international collaborations, which is a very important point. And on top of that, the overarching part is key enabling technologies. Now, in 2012, what we are doing at the moment is refining this document exactly in the frame of the words that have been mentioned very recently. The 4 main objectives or chapters of that are competitiveness, are enabling technologies, are an exploitation of space data, which is something very important. It's very nice to send beautiful satellites and get data, but don't have the money to reduce the data, which is the case in Europe. And the 4th one is particularly based on international collaboration. So this goes exactly along the frame of what has been presented by Mr. Gonzalez and is at the basis of the discussion on the table at the moment. So this is just a comment I wanted to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd like to end by reading, it's in a sense a question, but it's a comment that I think we should all take to heart, and it's from a college freshman. And it reads as follows: what about the next generation that will be running government? Obviously, space exploration is a long-term endeavor that will span generations, And so the issue of sustainability concerns not only sustaining our presence in space, but also sustaining the passion and energy for this endeavor across generations. As a college freshman, I wonder if my generation will be at all interested and will have the opportunity to invest their time in space exploration and space policy. And I think this is a good note to close on because it shows the responsibility that all of us of the older generation have towards the new generation. I teach freshmen every year. When I look at, we have to remind ourselves it's been over 40 years since Buzz and Neal stepped on the moon. And I thought back to myself what was happening 40 years before I was a freshman in college. And I know this dates me, but the First World War was just coming to an end. And that seemed to me like ancient history. And I think we have to remember that to the young generation of students today, our greatest feats of space exploration are ancient history. And we have a responsibility to them, all of us, every country that's represented here, every agency, every industry, to make it possible for them to experience the excitement that we all did when we saw the great heroic age of space exploration. So with that, I'd like to thank our panel members for what I think was a very productive interchange. And I think we have, before everybody leaves, we have a few announcements. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Before inviting you to the solarium again for a networking coffee break, let me draw your attention to a few things that will happen today. There will be one special panel in the morning in parallel to our technical sessions, starting at 10:30 in the Renoir room. This is a special panel discussion on the ISEC Global Exploration Roadmap, Missions and Technologies, Critical Capabilities Advancing Towards Mars. So don't miss that. There will be no plenary event, no plenary session this afternoon. We will only have technical sessions, and in parallel to the technical sessions, two more special panel discussions. One titled the ISEC Exploration Roadmap, Destinations and Commercial Markets, and that will take place in Renoir. And another one called Lunar Frontiers, Preserving Lunar History and Gaining Science Through Government Commercial Collaboration. This will take place in the Quorum room. The technical sessions and these special panel discussions will start in the afternoon at 2 o'clock. Let me also invite you to come back here to the big room at 5 o'clock for our closing ceremony this evening. And for those of you who are interested in the results of NASA and Google X Prize efforts to preserve lunar historic sites, I'd like to invite you to stay here for a few more minutes for a brief announcement. And I would like to invite now on stage Mr. John Shannon again, NASA Deputy Associate Administrator for Exploration from the Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate, and Mr. Alex Hall, Senior Director of Google X Prize, Mrs. Alex Hall, sorry, Senior Director